Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Interiors. My name is Alexis Dixon. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to two extraordinary gentlemen. First of all, Dr. Zachery, Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of San Diego. Second is Genjo Roshi, Zen Master, Spiritual Leader of the Zen Center in Seattle, Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Thank you both for being with me today on Interiors. What has the virus invited us to understand about who we are? We certainly have a sense of who we think we are. What, from your point of view, has the virus invited us to consider about who we really are versus who we think we are?
Well, one of the greatest teachers is mortality, facing our own mortality. And our fragility as a corporeal being. And when we face death, we learn a lot. And hopefully we actually learn how to live life better. But there's all kinds of things that our vulnerability has exposed for us. Our fragility as a species, but also the discrepancies around I think it's helped reveal actually the systemic racism that's a part of the fabric of our nation. And I think it's helped expose even the divisions in the nation and put them into more clear relief. So I think a crisis helps expose our underbelly. And those are my first thoughts.
I really like where you're taking that around the notion of mortality. And I think there's also the challenge in that mortality. And what I mean by that is simply that the denial of our mortality, I also think, is what the virus has revealed. And as a consequence of that, the push to something that resembles normal, whatever that may be, or an attachment to that thing that people are calling normal, really drives behavior so that we then see this second and third wave of the virus expressing itself and now even beginning to mutate. Which means to me that on some level, that whatever lesson we're supposed to be receiving, we haven't reached a critical mass of people who have received it. More of my concern is that not only has a critical mass not received it, is that the stubbornness around that as a human species really puts us in peril, not only in terms of the racial justice issues, but also in terms of what we're seeing manifesting in terms of climate, political polarity, and all kinds of other disparities that are just so much more available and at the surface. And I think the virus is trying to get us to pause long enough to see that, but yet we refuse. I think there's an arrogance as a species to recognize that the planet is trying to work with us through the virus to understand something different that we refuse to see.
Yeah, I heard a story I'm not quite sure where I heard it from, but that the animal kingdom got together and said, we've got to let these humans know somehow that they're exceeding their share and their limits and the capacities of the planet. And so whatever animal that the virus was passed from was given the solemn task in China of passing the message on. And so it's a wake-up call. Anytime we face mortality, it's a wake-up call. But this is a wake-up call to our whole species, and it is really a question: are we going to heed the call? Are we going to hear it? Are we going to rise to the challenge in a way that allows us to grow or evolve as a species into greater maturity? I often say to people who are willing to listen that I think that the past few millennium are probably just our species' adolescence. And it's about time we outgrow our adolescence, but adolescence is a very delicate time in terms of our survival. And will we survive our adolescence as a species? Here's a wake-up call that may help us find out.
One of the beauties of adolescence and young adulthood is the illusion of immortality, of invulnerability. And then I think what is happening is that this has assaulted that sense of, invulnerability. And the sort of manifestation of the virus is that the actual chronological younger people are least affected. And therefore, the sort of existential boundary is really very different. And all of that then makes it more difficult to hear. I know that what has happened with me sometimes is that I feel assaulted by the need to attend to this. And I also feel assaulted by the multiplicity of things that I have to attend to concurrently, the racial issues, the climate issues, the polarity issues. And it feels like too much for me to hold in consciousness at the same time. So the easiest thing to do is just to stay in denial of this. And I don't know if you have that experience, but I notice that even though there's a part of me that can see this, there's another part of me that prefers to push it out of consciousness.
Well, I feel very grateful to my meditation practice that I can, I offer group meditation on Zoom now 9 times a week. And in that practice, I have the chance to root, I like to think anyway, into something vast and boundless and much bigger than my own ego and even our species consciousness or adolescence. And that gives at least a few moments of peace of mind in the midst of this triple or quadruple storm that we're in, and of politics and racism and the pandemic and the ecological crisis. And so those brief moments of peace of mind that I attenuate or grateful to have twice a day or more is a great, great blessing that allows me not to get too overwhelmed. I'll say that one of the big parts of the pandemic is realizing I'm in a sort of safe cocoon. My wife's retired. I can work by Zoom. I have decades of white privilege that is becoming more and more conscious to me, just how privileged I am to be in my little cocoon, relatively safe. And I watch everybody else's suffering, people who are hungry or homeless or out of a job or working in first line of defense, either in the hospital or the grocery store, and thinking, wow, I am just so privileged to be sitting in my little cocoon. So that's just something that popped in my mind.
Well, this helps me on 2 levels, and I'd like to work this a little bit because in my, I do a daily walk, which is my form of meditation. I used to do more formal sitting, but in the pandemic, what I've noticed is that I've needed to have the movement to accompany the meditation. And what is wonderful is that during that time, I find my center, I find my peace, I find the connection to something greater. I find really the sort of experience of the larger consciousness. But yet the moment I step out of that, then the larger consciousness then reveals this other space. Mm-hmm. And so then it is the dance or the movement between recognizing the vastness of the universality and the immediacy of the contact with the reality. And so I'm trying to, I find myself struggling with that space. And I don't know if you're experiencing that as well.
Well, there's this kind of shock value, right? I mean, between those brief moments of being grounded and even transcendent, and then, in the craziness of this world, multi-dimensional craziness. and you know, I do feel, along with so many others, a bit at a loss. How do we move through this morass of craziness and grow from it? It's definitely a wake-up call, but will we rise to the occasion of really learning something and turning a corner that I think we haven't turned collectively towards some more sanity and what? Graciousness towards ourselves and the planet. We seem to be stuck in our either egoistic view of our, in a selfish way or in a panicked way. Either one is lost.
But isn't that seated and rooted in the illusion of separateness? I mean, when we talk about the egoic construction, I mean, the ego is all about self. It's all about the illusion of being separate from everything else. And so what is the tension between empathy and the illusion of separation, that I am my own person? We live in a society of rugged individualism, right? I have done this myself. And so the tension between my sense of belonging to the other and society's invitation for me to see myself as independent of everything, doesn't that create a messiness in our ability to not only find each other, but to love each other?
Yep.
Thank you.
I think your question really gets to the primary illusion that because we have this physical form and there's this illusion of singularity, the connection to our interconnection gets lost. You know, that's the easy part. The other part is that in terms of the virus itself, it is the singularity of its assault on me and my immune system, and then how it manifests itself, and then will it kill me? Then it really takes me into an I space. And then the challenge of this is that I, as a collective, as a human species, and its manifestation requires me to have a sufficient degree of altruism that I will take action in a way that will protect another I that may have greater vulnerability. And so this is the negotiation that is going on right now. And so therefore this separation is really pretty easy to live into on a daily basis. What I think our collective challenge is, and the opportunity that exists, is to recognize, as your question invites us to consider, is then what happens when we step outside of that? What happens when we recognize that the I is an illusion? It really is. That we are a part of something greater, that the universe is us and that we are it, and that's one thing. But how many people hold that sufficiently in consciousness long enough to live into it? And I think that's where we are right now. I really do.
Well, I think there has to be a critical mass of people who can sustain that level of consciousness. And I don't think it has to be a majority. It'd be lovely if it were a majority, but I don't think it needs to be a majority. I just think it needs to be a significant enough minority that sees other as an extension of self, but not in a narcissistic way. And I think we're building towards that. But clearly, you look at the aristocracy of Brazil and Hungary and the USSR and China and the United States and
thank you.
The Philippines and did I say Brazil? You know, it's
Brazil.
Yeah. There's a great resistance to sustaining this new or evolved view. And I don't quite get it, to tell you the truth. Why is there such resistance when it seems so obvious and so clear that we must have a paradigm shift if we're going to survive as a species in a compatible way with other species and the world itself. You know, our survival really depends on this shift, and there's a great deal of resistance around it. And frankly, it seems to be centered on people who think they have power and importance and are afraid to lose it.
We agree on one hand, but I think what we have to do, you and I, we have to drop below that, because that's pretty easy to project it out onto the leaders of those countries and the sort of populist aspect of that. I think that creates this sort of polarity that provides a wonderful polemic. But I think what we're being asked to do right now is to drop below that and then to find out, okay, then what does it take to get to that critical mass? And I'm trying to find it, and I really do have a sense of it literally at my center. And so let's see if we can find some language around that.
Interesting that you did that. I love the fact you said I could find it in my center, and you didn't say I can find it in my intellect. So what's the language of the intellect versus the language of what Dr. Green just embodied, which is the language of the center?
Well, I feel it too, Zachery, and I try to invite it with my fellow beings through meditation and caring open-heartedness, walking down the street, engaging with others, and in my social avenues that I'm connected with. So you start locally and think globally, but start locally. And so I think that's part of the answer. And there's this shift, though, that we need to somehow invite. We're so, one way you could say we're top heavy this way, or you could say that we are left brain centered and not enough right brain activated. And what can we do to help all of us activate more of our right hemisphere, so that the arts, for example, might be a way, and yet they've been so curtailed during COVID-19. But how can we getting people in nature? You know, you talked about, Zachery, going out for the walks. If we could get more people, that's one nice thing about the COVID-19 is that it's brought a lot of people out to parks because they didn't have it anywhere else to go. You know, they're away from the sports stadiums and out to the parks. And nothing wrong with sports, but the idea that we're getting back a little bit to nature, I think that's one invitation. The arts are another invitation. Meditation is another invitation. Ways to invite, enliven, turn on our right hemisphere.
Where I'm meeting you is when you talk about nature, art, and meditation. And as I felt into each of those, what I was noticing is that those all provide an opening, a potential. The art is an opening of the creativity. You know, the nature is literally an opening to something outside, you know, something larger, something greater. And meditation is an opening to a deeper consciousness. And so what I think we're beginning to discover as we deepen this conversation is that what happens when enough of us find that portal that is ours, that allows us to find a sense of connection to the other. And so that then there is no other, that there is just us, that we are then connected. And so when I think about when I write a poem, I know that the poem isn't mine, but it's been given to me as an expression. When I'm outside and then I take in seeing other people, and then I recognize, like in the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, that there's something that is eternal and greater that happens, and then I have the beauty of being able to witness something like that. And then when I step deeply into my meditation, that then there is something that is even more vast in terms of the wonderful opportunity to have consciousness in this embodied form for this whisper of time. And so if there is a way to invite people to recognize these different ways of opening, maybe that's part of what this year is trying to give us. But I don't know. I don't know.
Well, not knowing is a very creative space. So I hope we, I don't know, make the most of not knowing together and keep our creative juices and our hearts open for new avenues and channels that may be opening in front of us that we haven't seen before, of interdependence and connection and compassion, and seeing the disparities may help us, all of us, become more caring and realize outside of our more limited cocoon view of our self-interest and our safety and our advancement or security.
So in a society that always is rewarded for having answers, if I'm a CEO, I dare not show weakness by not having an answer. If I'm a teacher, an educator, a nurse, answers are critical. And so the idea of not having answers, it invites fear. It invites the possibility of psychological death, criticism, all those things. And yet, when we sit in not knowing, if we were to sit in that as a collective and say, okay, we don't know, what can we possibly create, right? How do we sit in not knowing and not feel the anxiety and the tension that comes with that? Because we live in a society that heavily rewards us for always having answers and not necessarily having questions.
You know, we've lost our connection to silence as a teacher. I would agree with you there.
And there's something valuable about that anxiety that comes in the midst of not knowing. It's a creative tension if you know how to tolerate it. But if you don't know how to tolerate it, you're always reaching for the polarity or the answer or the knowing that someone else has already created. And there's no room for creation. There's no room for evolution because there's no tolerance of not knowing. So that's another thing that I think meditation helps you with, is learning how to tolerate being in the midst of vast no knowing. And instead of grasping all the time for knowing and meaning and purpose, let's just rest and be in the not knowing. And then what creatively comes up with the crisis or the problems or the truth and reality of our time, our wisp of time.
Then in the anxiety, then it's a matter of enough of us being able to sit long enough with the uncertainty. And that uncertainty amid the complexity of the moment that we're in right now. And then the possibility then in the silence of a meditation, of a walk, of a creative act, that then we are able to then allow something to arrive to us that's different from the illusion of certainty that we had before. Maybe that's a part of this, you know, and I'm not suggesting it as an answer, but maybe that's what the moment is asking of us.
I've read, and I'm not a scholar, but that the Chinese ideograms for crisis is dangerous opportunity. So this is a dangerous opportunity when we're in a convolvence of crisis, multidimensional crisis, pandemics. And we have a chance, therefore, to be more creative than we've ever been before, perhaps, if we can tolerate the not knowing and wait somehow patiently, but you know, risk some experimentation and risk trusting some insight and waiting for his insight, and then trusting and experimenting with insight.
You've used the word, Dr. Green, you and I have talked a lot about complexity. We're talking about it here. We're a society that is slavishly addicted to linearity, to certainty, in a world that's anything other than linear and certain. So we seem to be living an illusion that's antithetical to our ability to meet each other in the messiness, the truth of existence, that it is messy, it's non-linear, we don't understand it. So is there some practical way to talk about how do we sit and embrace complexity? Is there some way that, you know, that is not just theoretical and it's a little bit woo, but if complexity and messiness is the truth of this existence, then how do we navigate our way through this in a very empathic kind of way? Because the initial engagement is to be fearful. If I don't have an answer, I'm fearful. If I hit messiness, I'm fearful. It's an affront to my intellect. It's an affront to my masculinity. I have to be certain. So how do I not choose fear to engage on certainty?
Well, what jumps in my mind is my brief kind of formula or instruction for meditation. Take a sit, breathe, and then listen. And watch for the wonder. It's all around us and through us. And when we catch the wonder of the moment, of this wisp of eternity, and the complexity of that, when we catch the wonder of it, we're likely to be inspired.
I like that language of the inspiration of it, and the notion of taking in the breath, you know, sort of like working from the etymology of really taking in breath as spirit. And then the idea of literally breathing into the uncertainty to allow something to happen. But the challenge is temporality, because the linear time you can sort of mark and measure. But I think the Greeks were right between the kairos and the chronos, you know, that sort of chronos time really reminds us that there's death. But the kairos time of the moment then allows us to be, and what Genjo you're talking about is really just being in the wonder of it. And I think when we're in the wonder of it, you know, I know that in many of the practices in meditation, then it's about creating the ever-widening circles of compassion. And how do we sit long enough in that sort of Tonglen practice to be able to find our circles of compassion that connect to other people? And maybe in that way, then we begin to work with not so much the fear, but the compassion. And not so much a large, vast majority, but a significantly connected minority who are really working to tip the balance of this so that much more of humanity is invited into that space with less fear.
Speaking of fear and the mortality that we're shaken with when we see, you know, more than 300,000 people taken by this one virus in this 1 year in this one country.
Right.
the fear that we feel in the midst of unknown or mortality or uncertainty, I think is aggravated by the reality or the realization of impending death, of the fact that we're not going to survive, and something's going to take us. At the very least, you know, we're going to die of something unless old age itself takes us. So it's brief. And the brevity of life becomes more and more of a realization. It kicks our instincts of survival into overdrive. And I think we get lost in our instincts of the survival. Do I have enough and I better keep it and I better have more? And yet there's another part of us that knows even if I have enough and I keep it and I have more, it's not going to work. I can have all, you know, all the protection and security and enough and more, and it's still not going to work. And yet we have these natural instincts that say, I better have enough and I better get more in order to survive. But wait a minute, I'm not going to survive. This is an existential matter that I think takes over even the best of us from time to time.
Absolutely. It's the sort of the paradox that is invariable and inescapable. And all you need is a COVID to sort of remind you of that. And then a mask is literally, the mask is a reminder of that, which I think is part of the resistance to that. But
yes,
I also
think you're right. That's really true.
Yeah. But I think that there's another piece to it as well, is that even if we unmask this thing, and even if we, you know, as the vaccine suggests that we may, then we're going to turn around and then these other manifestations of virulence are still going to be here. So you spoke earlier about white privilege, white supremacy, and its expression in this country. And that doesn't even speak to the different manifestations of dominance all across the globe that have different faces and different names to them. That is still going to be present. I read this awful article this morning about how in the placenta of babies, they are now finding microplastic. So even before a child comes into the world, they are already contaminated with the pollutants that we have placed in our world. And so we are no longer even able to come into the world without first being invaded by something of our own toxicity. And so it really is this kind of calamity that we're creating. And the only thing that keeps it from being comic is that it really does have the potential dire consequence, not only to our species, but to other species and this form of consciousness on the planet. I don't think that if people really just paused long enough to notice that, they would be as complacent about it as they are. But I think that that's the scary thing, is that then we would have to give up power. We'd have to give up the illusion of economic certainty. We would have to give up the sort of momentary relief that materialism provides, consumerism provides, and then this accumulation of attachment to all these things. We'd have to give up all of that and to step into something, but we don't know what that next thing is. And so let's stay with the illusion that we have.
At what point do we just have to sit back and just kind of laugh at ourselves and go, this means nothing at all? And not in a destructive way, right? Not by saying it means, not a destructive nihilistic engagement, right? But kind of a poof, an awareness. Now that I know it means nothing, let's engage in an empathic journey through this, because this is just a big sandbox and we're here to play, we're here to have fun, and at the end of the day, we're gone.
You want to take that first, Genjo?
You spoke, Zachery, about plastic and being infected from birth, even pre-birth. And I think we're also infected pre-birth by the generational madness of our separation from nature, which has been aggravated by the certainly from the Industrial Revolution forward in a very clear way. But this generational madness of not being connected to the land, to nature, and this making of borders and stockpiles of all kinds and even nation states where we're not a part of nature, we're somehow separate or superior to nature, we think. And that is a generational madness that has been building. And I think we're seeing the spoils of that generational madness being handed off to us for millennium. And how do we recover our communion with something, with nature, which we're a part of? We're very, very, very much a part of, and we're nothing but nature. And yet we feel so aggravatingly separate, inferior, or superior to it. And we've lost our seamlessness, and we have to recover it if we're going to get past our collective adolescence.
Where I can join you in this is that I've written about and talked about in other spaces the difference between, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, the difference between dominion and dominance, and that even if you accept the notion that humans have dominion, it has then transformed itself into dominance, which then creates the separation that you're talking about from nature. That's one aspect of it. But to link that to what Alexis was asking us as well, in terms of the whole nihilistic, I never know how to pronounce that word, but that nothing, it matters basically, is that I think it does matter in the sense of to use privilege differently than how it's been used in the current discourse, is that what a tremendous privilege it is to take this form and have sufficient consciousness to be aware of all of this, to be able to speak to it, to feel into it for just this brief fleeting moment in terms of a universal sense of time. And so I think that then that allows us to step out of it meaning nothing, but to allow it to be a part of a wave of consciousness that builds upon itself, so that there's this sort of like oceanic feeling that we're all a part of. And that we're contributing to it. What's that famous that I might just offer a verse, that's what we're here to do, and that sometimes we miss our opportunity to be that drop in the ocean, that verse in the sonnet, because we are attached to these illusory things that keep us no longer grounded to the earth, no longer connected to one another.
It sounds like the Plato's Republic, the cave. You're the man who escaped the cave and came back into the cave and informed those who were still chained and bound that what they were seeing were illusions of reality. And you do know what they did to him, right? They did not hug him and kiss him and embrace him. they killed him. And as you were speaking, I thought of Martin Luther King. I thought of Jesus, I thought of Buddha, I thought of all these men and women and saints, the Mother Teresa's of the world, who've invited us to find each other in brotherhood. And we have this ephemerality around that, and then we outsource it. So we look at men like Azim Kamisa, who forgave the boy who murdered his son. And they go, well, that's lovely, but I couldn't do that. We look at Martin Luther King and we go, well, he's special. We look at them. We tend to outsource our empathy, and somehow that frees us and emancipate us to then go about behaving on earth as we wish, because as Desmond Tutu once said, we're spiritual giants and we behave as dwarfs. Maybe again I'm asked, what seems to be ephemeral about our ability to stay within the realm of brotherly love within our institutions, within our political construct or corporate construct? What is this ephemerality we have that doesn't allow us to live there? Because intellectually we can speak about it, intellectually we can address it, and yet we come in, we go into it, we stick our toe in the water, and then we come back into this illusion of separateness.
You said something, going back a little bit, Alexis, about playing in the sandbox, and we're here to play, and then we're back. We're dust to dust. We are the sand. I do think we've lost our ability to play. Part of the right hemisphere part of our brain that knows that we're interdependent and I shouldn't say knows, recognizes our interdependence and our seamlessness, is very childlike and very creative and very free and willing to experiment and so creative and playful. Again, how do we invite enough, a significant enough minority to be the catalyst for a evolutionary leap?
Yes, and how do we, to use the language of your tradition, release the attachments that we have to the illusions? How do we also embrace what we haven't talked about as the shadow part of the human nature and not be so frightened of it, and to also invite its lessons so that it doesn't manifest itself sideways in violence and abuse and in war and in oppression and to degradation of the planet? Because I believe it is in those ways that gives us energy when shadow gets unleashed, but it also, when it's not appropriated back into us and owned as a part of ourselves, then it shows up in all of these different kinds of complex ways that we've been talking about for most of this time. And one other part that really is just coming to me right now is that I believe that there are enough of us already. We just don't know each other, that we haven't found each other, and that that this way of talking that we're talking right here amongst the three of us is reduced to new age talk or flaky or whatever. And I'm not talking about it from that way. There are intellectual ways to talk about this that are grounded only in intellect, which give the appearance, but that is only the appearance of it. There's a much more holistic element that this requires, which is an abundance of cosmologies that come together in a unified way that allows this to be. And we have not learned how to translate the different dialects of the same conversation. And I think what you've invited us to do, Alexis, is that in our different dialects, Genjo and I, that there may be something that we can find. If it's present here and then with the three of us, then there are likely others who, if they can sit long enough with the other, then they find themselves in the other. I think that's how it begins.
What institutions in our society do we look for to guide us down this path? Is both to Dr. Green and Genjo, certainly not government. I think the corporate sector struggles within its own construct to find itself. So what institutions do we have in our society that can begin the process of us beginning to engage in these types of conversations?
Well, I belong to an organization called Zen Peacemakers. And this is going back to something that you said that I thought was very important, Zachery, concerning our shadow. One of the things that the Zen Peacemakers do is they lead retreats into homelessness. They say, come be homeless for a week. Let's go as a group, feel what it's like to be homeless and not be a part of the dollar sort of economy, to live on the street and sleep in the park. Or let's go to Auschwitz and sit on the sorting tracks between the slave labor side and the gas chamber and sit in a place like that. Or we've gone to Rwanda or the old Yugoslavia and sat a week with various parties that had been genocidal towards each other. And to sit with, one of my Zen teachers said, you know, we're a rainbow between Buddha and a bumpkin. But I think it's wider. It's between Buddha and a kind of beast, a hurt beast that will devour you and each other. And if we don't know, if we can't get a hold of that range, we're stuck with blinders on. Yes. And you know, well, that's not me as a saint, and that's not me as a murderer. But I'm stuck here. I'm stuck with blinders on. I need to know myself as the fascist, and I need to know myself as the sage. Yes. And if I can't see all of that inside of me, I haven't looked hard enough.
You're helping me tremendously to see the challenge that's before us, because to use just the two of us, then that would require me seeing the white supremacist in myself. I don't want to look at him. And I don't want to believe that I've inculcated on some level that part. But by being a person in this nation, in this skin, some part of that has to be a part of me as well. And I think the challenge that we have, and going back to the original premise around COVID, is then how does anyone sit with something so unsavory that between the Buddha and the beast, that all of those are we, and that we then need to sit with that in each other. And I don't know if we yet know how to do that. And I don't know if the virus has yet taught enough of us that lesson.
I go back to what you did about 20 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, when you said, and you touched your heart and your center, and you said, I knew this to be here. You didn't question that. I mean, you said that with such clarity. And I thought, for an academic to say to the world, I know this to be in my center. Perhaps we know, but we don't value. May I ask you that question without being confrontational? Perhaps we have the answer, but we don't value where the answer resides. Is that possible?
The word value is not quite the experience. It's not trusting that it's real.
Interesting.
And not trusting that it can be, even though it already is, paradoxically.
Right. Yeah. Is it because it's not measurable and quantifiable? Is there something that's too amorphous about the language and the knowledge of the center that it makes it incomprehensible and immeasurable to the intellect?
Alexis, you and I have done this. It's not socially reinforced. You know, if, once I stop this call, I'm going to literally be in a different space that does not support anything that I've said for the last hour.
That's right.
So it's kind of hard to be in the isness of it when the next moment, there are these Christmas presents I haven't wrapped. I have a kid that's going to want to watch a basketball game. I have food that I haven't bought yet, that I need to, all of those kinds of things that sort of like those momentary, meaningful illusions then take the place of this depth of knowing that I was trying to reference.
So that's not portable.
I'm not sure it's not portable. I think it's like an old car radio when you used to push the button. It's on a different station, but there's a little too much static on the station right now. You can't get it quite clear enough, or I can't quite yet. And then then I'm going into the illusion of I. I don't know if enough of us are on that same station yet.
Because you went, Genjo, did you want to say something at all? Did you want to respond to any of that?
Well, one of the things that's lovely about this kind of conversation that we're having, we're not trying to come to some conclusion. And I'm hearing this deep resonance that I think is out there. It's how do we ignite the resonance that we're feeling in this conversation,
Yes.
Going beyond this conversation.
Exactly.
And, I'm back to the not knowing, but I feel comforted being in communion with two fellow human beings over Zoom in different parts of the country, feeling a heart connection. How strange is that?
Yes.
There's hope.
There's
Or,
hope.
let me put it this way. I don't like hope because that's always, we're thinking about the future. I have faith in our communion. If you're hearing that music back there, it was my cue that I need to be off this call soon.
Perfect. So the final question. You're both parents. Zach has 2 sons. Genjo, you have a daughter. And so my question is, how do we invest in the moral and civic intelligence of the next generation? How do we do that?
Well, with my youngest son, we are already beginning to make a pivot to a shared work around climate. One of his Christmas presents is that he will now have more than 200 trees that he does through hashtag Team Trees. And his whole goal is to have 500 trees by next year. But it's a small thing, but it's an important thing in terms of a consciousness that there is a way to do that. And that was manifested through one of his favorite YouTube people, and so what I'm trying to find is a connection with him. And then my other son, the older one, took critical thinking in his first semester of college. And what is wonderful is to engage with him in the language of critical thinking. And so now that when he looks out in the world, he can say, oh, that's a fallacy. And he says, no, faulty analogy there. And it's wonderful to really be able to see him then look at the world with much broader perspective. So I think we have a responsibility generatively to do that kind of thing.
My daughter's 36 and has a disability that has really cramped her ability to be in the workforce. And she said to me one time, and really brought me up short, she was about 30. And I was saying, well, kind of what are you going to do with your life, daughter? And she said, Dad, with my disability, I can either have a vocation or I can have a life. I choose a life. And I went, okay.
Okay.
I'll go with that. Hey, gentlemen, I've got to go.
I know you do. Genjo, Dr. Green, thank you.